Hello, and welcome to A Perspective on Crime, a podcast that explores contemporary research in criminology. In early 1902, Newton Heath were a Manchester football club on the brink of extinction. Debts mounted, crowds dwindled, and any attempt to raise money delivered results as dire as those on the pitch. At a small fundraising event organised to keep the club alive, Captain Harry Stafford brought along his beloved St Bernard, hoping the dog might draw some attention, or at least some goodwill. Unfortunately though, in all the noise and bustle, the dog slipped free of its lead and disappeared into the streets of Manchester. Stafford searched in vain, unaware that the wandering animal had been found by local brewery owner John Henry Davis. Impressed by the dog's size and gentle temperament, Davis took it in while he tried to track down the owner. When Stafford finally arrived to reclaim his dog, the two men began to talk. Stafford spoke honestly about Newton Heath's dire financial situation, and Davis found himself unexpectedly moved by the story of a club fighting for its life. Curious, Davis went to see the team for himself. What he discovered was a much-loved local institution with a committed and passionate community of supporters. Inspired, he stepped in. He cleared the club's debts, took ownership of its liabilities and the responsibility for its running, and he changed its name to Manchester United. Over the following century and a quarter, the ownership of the club has gone through a great many hands. Today, it's one of the most valuable sporting brands in the world. It's listed on the New York Stock Exchange, with the majority owners a family of Florida billionaires. The shift from community sports club to global entertainment corporation has accelerated faster than Ryan Giggs approaches a woman in a nightclub, and in the last 20 years has the football industry as a whole. With this expansion though, has football meaningfully guarded against itself being used to facilitate transnational financial crime? This episode will look at a research paper that shines a light on the often opaque world of football club ownership. The paper is titled Staying Onside: English Football, Illicit Finance and the Incoming Anti-Money Laundering Regime. It's authored by Dr. Peter Duncan and Professor Nicholas Lord from the Department of Criminology at the University of, well, where else? Manchester. Their research couldn't be more timely. For the very first time, a report published in July 2025 by the Home Office and HM Treasury, the National Risk Assessment of Money Laundering, has officially identified the football industry as being vulnerable to illicit finance. The assessment notes that football clubs and football agents are an attractive target for criminals, kleptocrats and other malign actors seeking to launder their criminal funds or generate further illicit finance. For years, concerns about dirty money in football have been based on anecdotal cases and headlines. What Duncan and Lord's research does is provide a critical first step in moving beyond those anecdotes. They systematically map the ownership structures of English football clubs to see if the evidence supports these official concerns and the tabloid speculation. The authors weren't acting as investigators though, trying to uncover specific instances of the crime. Instead, their aim was to analyse the structures of club ownership to see if they create vulnerabilities that could be exploited. This is about assessing risk, not making accusations. To do this, Duncan and Lord investigated three key risk factors that are often associated with financial crime. First, organisational complexity. This is when a club's ownership is spread across many layers of different companies, creating a confusing picture that makes it incredibly difficult to follow the money from the club back to the person at the top. Secondly, the use of secrecy jurisdictions. This refers to incorporating companies in countries whose laws make it easy to hide financial information. And it's not just the small island nations you might be thinking of. The authors cite the Tax Justice Network, which actually ranks the United States as one of the world's top providers of financial secrecy. Finally, there's the obstruction of beneficial ownership. This is about hiding the identity of the beneficial owner, a simple term for the person who ultimately owns, controls, and benefits from a company, not just a name on a piece of paper. To assess these risks, the researchers undertook a massive task. They mapped the complete ownership structure of every single club in the Premier League, the Championship, League One and League Two. They did this for the season 2024 to 2025. They achieved this by using a method of triangulation, pulling and cross-referencing data from corporate intelligence platforms like Orbis, as well as numerous open source records. In relation to complexity, they found a clear trend. Ownership structures get more complex the higher up the pyramid of leagues you go. In the Premier League, for instance, over half of the clubs have 3 or more corporate entities separating the club itself from its ultimate owners. That number drops as you move down the leagues. Regarding overseas incorporation, they found that top-tier clubs are far more likely to use companies based abroad. For clubs in the Premier League and the Championship, on average over 50% of the companies in their ownership structures are incorporated outside of Great Britain. The most frequently used overseas jurisdiction was, perhaps surprisingly, the United States, which appeared in the ownership network of 35 different clubs. This was followed by more traditional offshore centres, like the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands. Then there's the critical issue of hidden ownership, and here the findings are stark. For clubs in the top 3 leagues, the Premier League, the Championship and League One, approximately 65% have at least 10% of their ownership hidden behind opaque corporate entities, where the true individual owner simply can't be identified from public records. This is a figure that drops significantly to just 33% in League Two. Taken together, these findings paint a clear picture of an ownership landscape, especially at the elite level, that is complex, international, and often secretive. To explain the significance of this, the authors introduce a concept of conditions of possibility. What they mean by this is that while these structures are not in themselves proof of any wrongdoing, they create a perfect environment, the right conditions, where motivated criminals could operate without being easily detected. These structures provide what the authors call effective anonymity and isolation, shielding the real owners from the scrutiny of regulators, journalists, and the fans themselves. This echoes a warning from the National Risk Assessment, which noted that ownership structures using layered front and shell companies, often based overseas or in jurisdictions with low transparency, could obscure the ultimate beneficiaries of clubs and other major stakeholders, such as sponsorship agreements. Shell companies registered in secretive jurisdictions is the ideal setup for laundering money, evading tax, or disguising the illicit origins of funds used to buy a club. This research doesn't exist in an academic vacuum. It speaks directly to a major policy debates that are happening right now. The European Union is introducing new rules that, from 2029, will bring football clubs under its anti-money laundering regulations for the first time. Here in the UK, the government has recently created a new independent football regulator, the IFR, established by the Football Governance Act in 2025, which is expected to increase scrutiny on club finances and ownership. Duncan and Lord's work provides a concrete evidence base that shows exactly why this kind of regulatory attention is so urgently needed. Their findings help us understand the scale of the challenge and move the debate beyond suspicion and into the realm of structural risk. But the authors themselves point out the story is not entirely black and white. This is one of the work's strengths though, its nuance. Dr. Duncan and Professor Lord are very careful not to overstate their findings. They spend time exploring the complexities that lie beneath the data. They stress that complexity is not always a sign of crime. For example, they compare the ownership structures of the two Premier League clubs, Brentford, which is very simple with just one parent entity, and Crystal Palace, which is a web of 14 different entities. Both structures are perfectly legal. The key question the authors raise is whether the complexity serves a clear and legitimate business purpose. When it doesn't, that's when it becomes a red flag. They point to the use of secrecy jurisdictions. Registering a holding company in the US state of Delaware, for example, might simply reflect international investment trends and private equity norms, rather than a deliberate attempt to hide something illicit. The concern arises when the reason for using that jurisdiction is unclear or seems designed specifically to mask. If you've nothing to hide, you've nothing to fear, right? All of this leads to their central argument. The real risk isn't any single factor in isolation. Instead, the danger emerges from the combination of these factors. A highly complex structure that uses multiple entities registered in secret jurisdictions, which ultimately makes it impossible to identify the true beneficial owners. That is the combination that creates the conditions of possibility for illicit finance. Ultimately, this research isn't an accusation. It's a call for greater scrutiny and a demand for greater transparency, based on a systematic assessment of the structural vulnerabilities that exist within football. Duncan and Lord provide the first piece of evidence to show that English football club ownership, particularly at elite level, is a potential area for illicit finance. This is not necessarily because illicit finance is proven to be present, but because the structural conditions that enable it demonstrably are. English football is a product that is sold around the world. Beyond the talent and competition on the pitch, it's its fan culture that its most commodified characteristic. That culture has grown over generations. Supporters are wedded to a club that's part of their identity. For the identity of the people who ultimately own, or should I say, are custodians of the club, for them to be hidden is an obvious moral crime. This research suggests that that very anonymity may be a possible facilitator of actual crime. The research paper we've discussed today is titled Staying Onside, English Football, Illicit Finance and the Incoming Anti-Money Laundering Regime. It was authored by Dr. Peter Duncan and Professor Nicholas Lord from the University of Manchester. A link to the paper, as ever, is in the show notes, and of course, I'd urge you to read it for yourself. New episodes will drop every week, so make sure you subscribe and please recommend The Perspective on Crime to friends, colleagues, and anyone who you think might be interested. Finally, if you've read some research you think others should know about, drop me a message via the link in the show notes. If you yourself have new work coming out and you'd like it covered, please get in touch. Until next time, goodbye.